The day my grandfather died, I learned I wasn't the only granddaughter he had. That sentence still tastes strange on my tongue, like something bitter I'm not supposed to swallow. I remember the moment it happened, the moment my world bent in half and showed me a side of him I had never imagined existed. It was late afternoon, the kind where the light slants in through the curtains like it's tired. The whole house felt heavy, swollen with quiet. My mother was sitting on the far end of the sofa, her hair pulled back too tightly, the way she always did when she was trying to keep herself together. My father stood near the window, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the street as if grief might be waiting for him out there. I was sitting on the floor, my back against the coffee table, holding my grandfather's pocket watch, the one he never went anywhere without. The ticking had stopped, frozen forever at 2:17 p.m., the exact time he took his last breath. I was staring at it when the knock came. A soft, hesitant tapping. Not the kind people use when they bring food or condolences. No. This one felt different. My mother looked at me first, then at the door. My father went to open it. And that's when she walked in. A girl, no, a woman, about my age. Maybe a year younger. Her hair was dark and pulled into a loose braid. Her eyes were the part that made my chest tighten. They were the same shade as my grandfather's, a deep, thoughtful brown, with little flecks of gold that caught the light. She held a worn leather envelope in her hands. I'm sorry for your loss, she whispered, and her voice trembled as she spoke. I know this is strange, but I think we need to talk. My mother stiffened. My father's jaw clenched. And I couldn't breathe. The girl looked at me. Like she already knew who I was. Like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her eyes lingered on the pocket watch in my hands. Her lips parted. He gave me one, too, she said quietly. That was when everything inside me broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft internal cracking, the kind that changes the shape of you forever. Because I suddenly knew, in a way I didn't want to know. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She was connected to him. And somehow, to me. Normal life / before everything changed. If you had asked me before that day, I would have told you my grandfather was the most predictable, steady man on earth. He was the type who woke up at the same time every morning, 4:45 a.m., without fail. He brewed his tea strong, boiled in a little steel pot he claimed was older than my father. He read the newspaper cover to cover, humming under his breath. He had this old armchair by the window that squeaked whenever he leaned back, and I used to joke that it was complaining about holding him for so many years. Every Sunday, we had lunch together. Not breakfast. Not dinner. Lunch. He said it was the perfect meal, halfway through the day, full of possibilities. My mother would make roti, lentils, and chicken curry the way he liked it, with less spice and more lemon. And after we ate, he and I would sit on the porch while he told me stories. Not fairy tales. Never those. Real stories, at least, that's what I thought they were. Stories about the old days, his childhood in a crowded neighborhood, his early years working in a factory, his struggles, his triumphs. They were always simple, quiet stories. But they made me feel like I knew him. Truly knew him. I would rest my head on his shoulder sometimes, and he'd pat my hand like he was reassuring both of us that time wouldn't take this away. He always smelled faintly of sandalwood soap and the peppermint candies he kept in his pockets. And whenever he laughed, really laughed, he had this habit of covering his mouth with the back of his hand, like he didn't want to bother anyone with his joy. He was gentle. He was dependable. He was mine. At least, that's what I believed. And I believed it so deeply that it shaped everything about how I saw family, trust, and love. My parents often said I was his favorite, though my mother tried not to sound jealous when she said it. And maybe she had reason to be. He used to call me my little mirror, because he said I looked like him more than I looked like either of my parents. I loved that. It made me feel chosen. Special. Seen. Sometimes, we would sit for hours in comfortable silence. No pressure to talk. No expectations. Just two people who understood each other the way only some families do. Or so I thought. I remember one particular Sunday, maybe a year before he died. He'd seemed tired. Not sick, just heavy. Like his thoughts were weighing him down. I asked him, "Dada, are you okay?" He smiled, that soft, warm smile of his, and tapped the pocket watch against my wrist. "There are things in a man's life," he said, "that don't fit neatly into stories." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was talking about regrets, or youth, or maybe the aches in his knees. But now I think he was trying to tell me something. Something he wished he had the courage to say out loud. I wish I had asked. I wish I had pushed a little more. I wish I had paid attention to the shadows behind his smile. Because sometimes, the people we love most are the ones hiding the deepest truths. And sometimes, we only see the cracks when it's too late to ask why they were trying so hard to stay whole. As the girl stood in our living room that day, her hands trembling, her eyes shining with a pain that felt too familiar, I realized I was about to step into a story my grandfather never told me. A story he hid. A story he left behind like a locked door. And that girl, the stranger with his eyes. She was holding the key. The girl sat down on the edge of our sofa as if she wasn't sure she belonged on furniture someone else paid for. My mother didn't invite her. She didn't have to. The girl carried herself like someone who already knew she had a right to be here, even if she wished she didn't. My father closed the door quietly, as if loud noises might make everything worse. I stayed on the floor, still gripping the pocket watch. Still frozen. The girl took a slow breath. "My name is Amina," she said. "And I think your grandfather was my grandfather too." For a moment, the room held its breath with us. My mother's voice was the first to break the silence, sharp, controlled, trembling at the edges. "That's impossible." Amina didn't flinch, but she lowered her eyes, like she'd expected that response. "I know what it sounds like," she whispered. "I know how it must feel. Trust me." It felt that way for me, too, when I found out. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. Found out. What did she mean? My father spoke next, his voice deep but steady, the way it gets when he's trying not to lose his temper. "Where are your parents?" he asked. "Did they send you here?" She shook her head. "No. They don't know I came. They don't know any of this." "Not really." She opened the leather envelope and pulled out an old photograph, the edges soft, the colors faded. My throat tightened. It was my grandfather. Younger, maybe in his 30s. Standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. Her arm was looped through his. They were smiling. Truly smiling. The kind of smile that comes from familiarity and love. And in his arms, a baby girl. Amina placed the photo on the table and gently pushed it toward us. "This is my mother," she said quietly. "And that's me." My fingers twitched around the pocket watch. I don't know how long I stared at the picture. Time blurred. My breath felt too loud in my chest. Finally, I managed to whisper, "Why are you here?" Amina swallowed hard. "Because I think your grandfather wanted you to know," she said. "I think he wanted someone from his real family, to understand." My mother's jaw tightened. "Are you calling us fake?" Amina looked up, her eyes wide, wounded. "No. Never. I just need answers. And I think you do, too." I hated that she was right. But I didn't know that yet, not fully. Back then, I was clinging to the image of my grandfather that I'd always known. The man who read newspapers with me. The man who saved candies in his pockets for me. The man who told stories about factories and childhood and hard work, but never about love. Never about another family. Never about her. The first clue I ignored. The night after Amina left, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too heavy, like grief had stretched itself across every wall. My mother refused to talk about it. She went straight into the kitchen and started scrubbing dishes that were already clean, her hands moving faster than her breath. My father kept pacing. He didn't look at me. Or at my mother. Or at the picture Amina left behind. I went to my room and closed the door. I stared at the ceiling. At the shadows. At the faint lines of light slipping in from the street lamp outside. And then I remembered something. A memory so small and quiet that I had buried it without meaning to. Last year, 9 months before he died, I visited my grandfather unexpectedly. My classes had ended early, and I decided to surprise him with some homemade kheer I'd spent the whole morning perfecting. When I reached his house, the curtains were drawn. Not unusual. He didn't like the sun in his eyes. But when I knocked and walked in, he jumped, actually jumped, like I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't. I laughed and teased him. He didn't laugh back. On the coffee table, I noticed 2 cups of tea, both still steaming. Was someone here? I asked. He hesitated. Just for a second. A small, tiny second, the kind you only notice later. Then he said, "Just an old friend," and changed the subject. At the time, I believed him. I didn't think twice. He had lived a long life, of course he had old friends. But now that memory crawled back into my mind with sharp edges. 2 cups. Still warm. And the way he'd pulled one of them closer to himself, as if hiding it. My chest tightened. Was it her? Her mother? Someone else entirely? Someone from the life he never shared with us? I tried to shake it off. My mind must have been inventing things, twisting memories the way grief does. My grandfather was not the kind of man who lied. He was gentle. Thoughtful. Predictable. But the harder I tried to cling to that version of him, the more something inside me whispered. What if you never really knew him at all? The suspicion grows. A week passed. We buried my grandfather on a cool morning, the sky gray but calm. I wore a simple black shellwork camise, and I remember thinking he would have scolded me gently for wearing such dull colors. After the funeral, people filled the house, neighbors, relatives, family, friends. Food was passed around. Stories were shared. Everyone talked about him like he was the same man to all of us. Reliable. Quiet. Loving. Reserved. But as I listened, something inside me felt off balance. Like a picture frame that had been hanging straight for years but suddenly tilted. I kept thinking about Amina's eyes. Her voice. Her photograph. And the tiny sharp memory of those 2 steaming cups. My grandfather's life felt suddenly uneven. Like a rug pulled halfway off the floor, exposing something underneath. And then, something happened that made my heart sink even further. After everyone left, I went to sit in his old armchair. The one that squeaked when he leaned back. I ran my hand along the armrest. The fabric was worn from years of his touch. As I leaned back, something poked the side of my leg. I reached between the cushion and found a folded piece of paper. A receipt. Not from a grocery store. Not from a tea stall. But from a hospital. Dated 2 years ago. The patient's name wasn't his. It was a woman's. A name I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat. Why would my grandfather have paid a hospital bill for a woman none of us knew? Why hide it? Why keep the receipt? Unless it meant something. Unless she meant something. I clutched the receipt tightly, feeling the first true wave of fear wash over me. Something wasn't right. And deep down, I knew this was only the first thread of a much larger truth. A truth my grandfather had woven carefully. Quietly. Deliberately. And kept hidden. Until now. I didn't show my parents the hospital receipt. Not yet. Something inside me told me to wait, not out of secrecy, but out of fear. Fear of confirmation. Fear of what my mother's face might look like if she realized her father hadn't been the man she believed he was. Fear of what I might see reflected in my father's eyes. But mostly, fear of how it would change who I was. I pressed the receipt flat on my desk, smoothing its creases with shaking fingers. The woman's name, Shabnam Noor, was printed neatly at the top, followed by a patient ID and a date I couldn't shake from my mind. 2 years ago. 2 years ago, my grandfather had told us he was traveling to visit an old friend in another town. 2 years ago was also when he started telling fewer stories on Sundays. When he began leaving lunch early, saying he was tired. When he once missed our weekly lunch entirely, the first time in my entire life, and apologized with an excuse that sounded rehearsed. Back then, I assumed age was wearing him down. Now, I wasn't so sure. I placed the receipt next to the pocket watch on my table. Together, they felt like mismatched puzzle pieces waiting for a bigger picture. The second visit. 3 days after the funeral, Amina came back. This time, she didn't knock like she was unsure of her welcome. She knocked like someone determined. My mother opened the door, her face stiff. She didn't invite her in. But she didn't shut the door on her either. "I'm sorry," Amina said. "I know this is difficult. But I think we need to talk again." Her voice was soft, too soft for the kind of truth she was about to speak. My mother sighed and stepped aside. We sat at the dining table. The chairs felt too cold, too formal for a conversation like this. My father stayed standing, arms crossed. I was the first to speak. "You said your mother was in the photo," I said, my eyes on the image still sitting on the table. "Did she know my grandfather?" Amina hesitated before answering. "Yes. She knew him." "How?" I asked. She took a long breath. "My mother, she was married," Amina said. "Unhappily. Her husband was a difficult man. Angry. Controlling. She felt trapped." She paused, her eyes glistening. I felt something twist inside my chest. "My grandfather," Amina whispered, "helped her leave." I blinked slowly. Confusion and dread curled around each other in my stomach. "Helped her leave, how?" I asked. Amina looked at me, really looked, as if bracing for judgment. "They were close," she said softly. "Very close. Closer than they should have been." My mother inhaled sharply. My father stiffened. I felt the room tilt. "You're saying he had an affair," my mother said, her voice cold. Amina didn't respond immediately. She simply lowered her gaze. "I'm saying, he loved her," she finally whispered. The silence that followed was the kind that can split a family in half. A history I never knew. It felt impossible. My grandfather? The man who refused to drink chai unless it was exactly the right temperature? The man who kept every birthday card I ever made him? The man who walked slowly, spoke softly, lived quietly? That man, capable of a secret love? A life outside ours? A child? Another granddaughter? My voice cracked when I spoke. "How long?" Amina swallowed. Her hands trembled in her lap. "My mother knew him for almost 30 years. 30 years. My mind reeled. That meant before I was even born. Before my parents married. Before my mother even finished college. 30 years of a second story running parallel to ours. 30 years of Sundays. 30 years of pocket watches and peppermint candies and newspaper humming. 30 years of him living 2 lives so seamlessly that none of us, ever suspected it." My father shook his head. "Why would he hide this from us?" Amina looked up, her expression hollow. "Because my mother begged him to. She didn't want to destroy your family. She didn't want to shame him. She didn't want to bring pain into his home." Her voice broke. "And she didn't want anyone to know about me." My breath caught. Why? Amina closed her eyes briefly, as if collecting pieces of strength. Because she was scared. And because her husband, the man she left, he wasn't the kind of man you can leave without consequence. A chill swept over me. What happened to her? I asked quietly. Amina hesitated. She passed away, she whispered. Last year. I felt a small, sharp ache in my chest, not only for Amina, but for my grandfather too. He must have grieved. Alone. Silently. While sitting in his squeaking armchair, reading newspapers he no longer absorbed. Suddenly, his heaviness made sense. His tired smiles. His quiet sighs. His sudden early departures from Sunday lunch. He'd been mourning someone he couldn't tell us about. Someone he loved. Someone he wasn't allowed to claim. And we never noticed. I closed my eyes, and an image formed in my mind. My grandfather sitting in that old armchair, holding two versions of his life in his hands and not knowing what to do with either of them. The journal. Amina lifted her bag and pulled something out, a worn notebook with fraying edges. He gave this to my mother, she said, placing it gently on the table. She gave it to me before she died. She told me, if anything ever happened to him, I should bring it to you. Why us? I asked. Because she said your family deserved to know the truth. She said he suffered enough carrying it alone. My mother flinched. Suffered. That word. It didn't fit the picture she'd always painted of her father. Amina slid the notebook toward me. For you, she said softly. For me? I echoed. She nodded. He talked about you often. More than anyone. He said you were the only person who would understand. My throat closed. Understand what? The double life? The choices? The secrets? My hands trembled as I reached for the notebook. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, something warm and familiar pulsed through me. It smelled faintly of sandalwood. His scent. Suddenly, my heart thundered in my chest. My grandfather had written something. Something he hadn't said aloud. Something meant for me. And as I held the notebook in my hands, I felt a truth settle over me. Whatever was inside. It was going to change everything. I didn't open the journal right away. Even though it sat on my lap like a heartbeat I hadn't heard yet. I couldn't bring myself to peel it open. Not with Amina watching me with those trembling eyes. Not with my mother's face pale and tight as a drawn thread. Not with my father's anger simmering in the room like a storm gathering heat. So I placed the journal gently on the table and whispered, "Can we talk alone? Just you and me?" Amina nodded immediately. She seemed grateful for the space, maybe even relieved. We stepped out into the small backyard, the one my grandfather used to sweep every morning with a broom that was older than me. The sun was beginning to set, turning everything golden soft. The air smelled like wet earth and jasmine from my mother's plants. We sat on the low brick wall near the mango tree. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Amina finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to bring pain." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was still holding. "You didn't bring the pain," I said softly. "You brought the truth." She blinked rapidly, and tears gathered in her eyes. Not dramatic. Quiet. The way my own tears come. "I didn't want to be someone's secret," she whispered. "But that's what I was. My whole life." I turned toward her. "Did you know him? Before now?" She nodded. "He came to see me sometimes when I was younger. Not often, but enough that I knew he cared." Her voice broke a little. "He taught me how to tell time. He bought me my first school bag. He would bring me candy, peppermint, the same kind he kept in his pockets." My heart twisted. Peppermint. Of course. A piece of him that remained consistent, across both lives. I took a slow breath. Why didn't he tell us? I asked. The question felt childish and impossible at the same time, like asking why rain falls or why clocks eventually stop. Amina hugged her arms around herself. Because he thought he would lose you, she whispered. All of you. He loved you so much. He talked about your mother with so much pride. He said she was the reason he became the man he was. My throat tightened. And what about you? Your mother? A sad smile crossed her lips. He loved her too. More than he ever expected to. More than he believed he had the right to. A gust of wind rustled the leaves above us, scattering a few yellow ones to the ground. Finally, I asked the question that had been crushing my chest. Were you angry with him? She hesitated. Yes, she admitted. For a long time. Because I only ever had half of him. Because I kept thinking, if he loved us, why couldn't he love us openly? She turned her face toward me. But I also understood him. More than I wanted to. Life isn't neat. Love isn't clean. People make choices that don't fit inside straight lines. Her words sat inside me like a quiet ache. My grandfather, the man I believed was steady, unchanged, solid, had lived a life that was anything but simple. And now, the truth sat on a table inside my house, bound between worn pages waiting for me to turn them. Opening the journal. Later that night, after Amina left and my parents went to bed without speaking to each other, or to me, I sat alone in the living room. The lights were dim. The house was still. Only the wall clock ticked, steady and soft, like my grandfather's pocket watch used to tick in his shirt. The journal sat on the table, waiting. I picked it up with both hands, like it was something fragile. Something sacred. The cover was worn smooth at the edges. The pages yellowed slightly. It smelled faintly of him, sandalwood, ink, and something warm that I could never name. My breath trembled as I opened to the first page. His handwriting stared back at me. Neat. Careful. Every letter shaped with intention. My vision blurred before I even started reading. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. My lips parted. My heart squeezed painfully. And if it is you reading this, my little mirror, then it means I trusted you with the pieces of me I never managed to say aloud. I touched the words gently with the tips of my fingers. He meant me. He wrote this, for me. I have lived a life I am not proud of, but also not ashamed of. Humans are complicated creatures. And I was no exception. I swallowed hard, tears slipping past my lashes. There was another woman, Shabnam. I loved her. I loved her in a way I did not expect to love again in my old age. I loved her quietly, because loudly would have broken too many people I cared for. My hand shook. She was not a mistake. And neither is the child she brought into this world. A tear fell onto the page, darkening the paper. I was wrong to hide her from you. I was wrong to hide her from everyone. But I did it because I feared losing the family I had spent my whole life building. My breath trembled. And I feared losing the family I found unexpectedly. I closed my eyes, pressing the back of my hand against my mouth to keep the sob from escaping. The words blurred, but I kept reading. If you ever meet Amina, please be kind to her. She carries more weight than someone her age should. She carries my silence, my mistakes, my fear, and my love. A sob slipped out, small and broken. She is your family. Even if the world would not understand, even if your mother will not forgive me, you, my little mirror, you will understand. You always did. I pressed the journal to my chest. Memories of him flooded my mind, his soft smile, his steady hands, his quiet laughter, the way he'd pat my shoulder as if my presence alone steadied him. He trusted me. He knew me. He chose me. Even in his hidden life, he saw me as the one who could hold the truth without letting it destroy me. The betrayal hits hard. As I closed the journal, something deep inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was grief in its rawest form. But not grief for his death. Grief for the person I thought he was. Grief for the version of him that lived only in my head. Grief for the stories he never told me. And beneath that grief lay the first spark of betrayal. Because he knew. He knew this would tear us apart. He knew this would change everything. He knew his silence was a choice. And he made it anyway. I ran my hand over the journal again, feeling the indent of his pen strokes beneath my fingertips. Then I whispered into the quiet room. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice broke. I would have listened. The house absorbed my words, but no answer came. Just the soft, steady ticking of the clock. The same rhythm as his watch. The same rhythm as the time he left behind. The truth didn't stay a quiet, hidden wait for long. A week after I'd finished reading the journal, Amina returned. This time, she brought something else with her: documents, photographs, letters, even small trinkets my grandfather had sent her mother over the years. Each item carried a piece of a life my family never knew. We sat in the living room, the same room where I had first learned she existed. I placed everything on the coffee table, trying to take in the enormity of it all. The first thing my mother saw was the letters. Handwritten notes from my grandfather to Shabnam, some small, tender, almost innocent, some raw with unspoken longing. The language was restrained, but the meaning was unmistakable. My mother's hand trembled as she picked one up. She read a line, then another. Her eyes widened. Then, finally, she slammed the letter down and looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw her scared. Why didn't he tell us?" she whispered, her voice cracking like ice. "How could he do this?" Amina didn't answer at first. She simply met my mother's gaze, calm but resolute. "Because he loved you," she said softly. "And he was terrified of hurting you. That's why this was hidden." It wasn't malicious. It was complicated. But complicated didn't soften the blow. Soon after, I knew we couldn't keep it inside these walls. My father called relatives one by one. Some came immediately, curious, others hesitated, unsure of how to face a revelation that shook everything they believed about a man they had all admired. The letters, the journal, the photographs, everything spilled into the open like water from a broken dam. Conversations erupted in hushed voices at first, then louder, more emotional. Some family members were shocked. Some were angry. Some were deeply confused. One of my uncles, who had always looked up to my grandfather as a model of integrity, stood in the middle of our living room and said, "So, all this time, we didn't even know who he really was?" His voice carried disbelief. Rage. Sadness. I watched as our community absorbed the truth. People who had once visited our house for tea now whispered outside the gate. Neighbors looked at us differently. Friends avoided us for a few days, unsure how to approach a family with such a scandal attached. Amina, in the middle of it all, never once raised her voice. She simply answered questions with honesty, showing the evidence, but never blaming anyone. She let the truth speak for itself, and it did. In a way, my grandfather's choices came with consequences even after his death. The family he built in our home had to reconcile with the life he had led elsewhere. People we had known and trusted had to adjust their understanding of him, not as a saint, but as a human being, capable of love, mistakes, and secrecy. Even I felt the sting. I had always prided myself on knowing him, on being close to him, on understanding him better than anyone else. And yet, here I was, forced to face the reality that even I hadn't known him fully. It felt like a betrayal, a wound in the fabric of my memory. But it wasn't just about anger. It was about perspective. A few days later, a distant cousin came by. He had heard the story from someone in the neighborhood. He looked at the letters and the journal, then looked at me with something I hadn't expected: sympathy. "Your grandfather, he wasn't perfect," he said quietly. "But neither are we. Maybe this is his way of showing us that life isn't as simple as we think." He carried two worlds. And he kept them from colliding. That That's a kind of bravery, I think. I nodded, the weight in my chest easing slightly. Even the community eventually softened. People stopped whispering outside our gate, stopped staring. They began to understand that my grandfather's secrecy wasn't meant to harm anyone. He had simply made choices that were difficult, human, and ultimately impossible to share openly. In those weeks, Amina and I became bridges between our two worlds. Slowly, our families started talking to each other. Letters were exchanged. Photos were copied. Names were remembered. Stories were shared. One afternoon, my mother came to me, her hands clutching the first letter my grandfather had ever written to Shabnam. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, but not the harsh tears of anger. "He loved both of you," she said quietly. "And maybe, we can forgive him for what he couldn't say." It was the first time she had spoken to me with gentle warmth in days. And I realized that public consequence isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's revelation. Sometimes it's the unraveling of a life so carefully hidden that it demands acknowledgement and understanding. I never expected to feel pride in the aftermath of betrayal. But seeing Amina accepted into the family circle, watching people learn to treat her as one of us, seeing my mother begin to let go of bitterness, it was something I hadn't anticipated. The public consequences didn't just fall on my grandfather. They fell on all of us. And yet, through them, we began to heal. We learned that truth, no matter how late, must be acknowledged. We learned that love doesn't fit into tidy boxes, and families don't always fit the image we imagine. And most importantly, we learned that even when secrets come to light, they can teach compassion, resilience, and the courage to forgive. The weeks after the revelations were strange. Quiet, but not in the way I had imagined. It wasn't silence born of absence or death, it was silence born of reflection. I spent many mornings alone in my grandfather's old armchair, journal in hand, reading passages I hadn't absorbed before. The lines about love, mistakes, fear, and family had a rhythm now, a heartbeat I could finally feel without pain. Amina and I had grown close in those weeks. Not sisters exactly, but something just as strong, a bond forged in shared grief, shared discovery, and shared understanding of a man who had shaped both our lives in ways we had only begun to comprehend. She would visit in the afternoons, and we would go through letters together, sometimes laughing softly at his dry humor, sometimes crying quietly when we read words heavy with longing. One afternoon, as the sunlight fell in slanted beams across the living room, my mother joined us. She carried a tray of chai and cookies, setting it down gently. For the first time, she didn't flinch at Amina's presence. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, a small gesture of acceptance. "I think he wanted this," my mother said softly, almost to herself. "Not the pain. Not the secrets. But this. He wanted us to come together." And somehow, in that simple statement, a weight lifted. I realized then that healing isn't about erasing the past. It isn't about pretending everything was perfect. Healing is about acknowledging truth, holding it gently, and choosing to move forward without letting it crush you. I also began to understand my grandfather differently. Not as the man I thought I knew, but as a human being who carried love in multiple forms. A man who made mistakes, yes. But a man who also loved fiercely, deeply, and sometimes painfully. There were days I felt anger flare up, brief, sharp, like a match striking. Anger at him for hiding so much. Anger at myself for never noticing. Anger at the silence, at the loss, at the way secrets can shape a life without your consent. But alongside the anger was something quieter, understanding. Empathy. Compassion. And eventually, forgiveness. I started to write letters of my own. Not to my grandfather, that was impossible now, but to Amina, to my mother, to the versions of myself that had hurt and trembled under the weight of his secrets. Writing gave me space to grieve, space to celebrate, space to feel the complexity of love and life without judgment. Our family dinners slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though the normal was new, different, deeper. We shared stories, old ones, yes, but also new ones. Stories about Amina, about Shabnam, about choices made in silence. We laughed more freely now, knowing the man we loved wasn't perfect, but he had loved truly. I even found myself sharing his journal with other relatives, one page at a time. Each time, I watched their expressions soften, their hearts open a little wider. They saw him, all of him, the good, the mistakes, the quiet regrets, the love. And in seeing him fully, they began to see themselves more fully too. One evening, I sat on the porch, just as I used to with him. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the air fragrant with jasmine from the garden. Amina sat beside me, her hand brushing mine. "Do you miss him?" she asked quietly. I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said softly. "But I also feel him in the stories he left behind. In the love he gave, and the love we are learning to share. I don't just miss the man I thought he was. I miss the man he truly was, and I'm grateful for that." She nodded. "He trusted us," she said. "Even in hiding, he trusted us to find the truth." I smiled, a small, reflective smile. It wasn't joy yet, not fully. But it was peace. And that mattered. The healing continued in small, quiet ways. Amina visited often. My mother began to speak more openly about her father, acknowledging both the grief and the lessons. I learned that love can be complicated, that family can have hidden branches, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means embracing reality with courage. I began keeping a small notebook of my own. Not secrets this time, but reflections, lessons, and memories of my grandfather. Lessons about love, about fear, about courage, and about the quiet strength it takes to hold two truths at once, the one you want, and the one that is. In the evenings, I would sometimes hear the soft ticking of the pocket watch on the table, a small, steady reminder that life continues, that love persists, and that even in imperfection, there is beauty. And slowly, quietly, I realized, I was no longer just his little mirror. I was my own person, capable of holding his legacy, carrying the lessons forward, and choosing a life shaped by understanding rather than anger. We found peace. Not because everything was perfect. Not because the secrets didn't sting anymore. But because we chose to honor truth, to love despite mistakes, and to see people, even those we grieve, in all their complexity. I still keep my grandfather's pocket watch on my desk. Sometimes I touch it, feeling the small indentation where his fingers rested so often. Sometimes I open his journal again, reading the passages I've memorized, tasting the careful weight of his words. And sometimes I wonder, how many of us live our lives carrying pieces of secrets? How many of us hide the truths we think will hurt others, only to realize that the pain grows heavier when it's hidden? I don't tell this story to cast blame. I tell it because life is complicated. People we love are not perfect, and neither are the paths they choose. My grandfather lived a double life, yes. He made choices that were difficult to understand. But he also loved, deeply and fully, in ways that shaped both me and Amina. If there is one thing I learned, it's this: love is not always neat. Families are not always tidy. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is to carry your truth, even when the world may never fully understand. Would you have been able to forgive him? Could you have held the secret in your heart and still chosen love? I invite you to reflect on that. Life rarely gives us perfect answers, but it gives us the chance to understand, to empathize, and to heal. If my story resonated with you, please consider supporting the channel. Like, subscribe, and share your own reflections in the comments. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me your own stories of love, loss, and the truths that shaped you. Because sometimes, sharing is the only way to keep the heart alive.